So you.
Okay, it's been our custom sometimes to offer our awardees either to give a talk from the podium or be interviewed. One of the first people I recall doing this was Walter Cronkite when we gave him an award many years ago. And it's a nice format, and tonight we're honored to have Robert Costa be the rapporteur, or whatever we shall call him, with Brian tonight. Robert Costa is a national political reporter for the Washington Post, covering the White House, Congress, and national campaigns. At the Post, he regularly travels the country and hosts in-depth live interviews with major political figures. He also moderates PBS's Washington Week, an award-winning program that focuses on reporting and public affairs, and a political analyst for NBC News. He frequently appears on Meet the Press, Morning Joe, and C-SPAN. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Notre Dame and a Master's from the University of Cambridge.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm Bob Costa. Great to be with you tonight, and such an honor to be here with Brian Lamb, who is an inspiration, a friend, a mentor to me and so many journalists who admire his commitment to civics for decades, to educating this country, his love of politics and history and literature. C-SPAN is a monumental achievement, as is your career and especially your integrity. So a round of applause for Brian Lamb. Brian and I usually talk politics when we get together, and we'll get to that maybe a little bit. But so much of C-SPAN comes back to satellites and your own work back in the early 1970s and the establishment of the domestic satellite system in this country. So when you think about C-SPAN and satellites, how did it happen, and what did you see early on with Clay Whitehead, Tom Whitehead, and others about how satellites could contribute to the education and civics in this country?
Well, Bob, I'd have to say right up on top that I had a mentor named Tom Whitehead, and he probably could have the Clay, his name is Clay, Tom Whitehead, he could probably have the Clay Award today like Arthur C. Clarke has, because he took his idea, the geostationary orbit for a satellite, and applied it to policy development in this country. And I was there with him right after he had done this when he was in the White House, and started learning from him about the need for more voices on the television screen. And he would love today seeing what's happened. It's not perfect what's happened, but believe me, compared to the amount of information we were getting back in 1979 and earlier than that when I worked for him in 1971, it's just exploded. Tom was a genius. Sadly, we lost him 11 years ago at a very young age of 69. But I was there and watched him develop policies that has opened this whole thing up. If we didn't have the satellite, the geostationary satellite, the open skies policy, really what he promoted was competition in the skies that kept the price of communications down and then allowed our little operation to start, because we could have never afforded the AT&T price to get throughout the United States.
Well, when you mention AT&T, you're referencing a time when AT&T was one of the major controllers of communications in this country. You had only 3 television networks. What were the challenges before C-SPAN, at the outset of C-SPAN, as you dealt with trying to establish a new channel within this satellite system?
I think Walter mentioned this earlier. Arthur C. Clarke said it right. The first step is nonsense. And I got a lot of that when I started trying to figure out a way to get into this business. And people would look at it and say, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. It still may be the dumbest idea, but at the time it was very difficult to get beyond the nonsense step. And I probably got 50 to 100 no's. One of the great lawyers, satellite lawyers in this country, is in this audience, and he was general counsel for Tom Whitehead, Henry Goldberg. And in the early days, Henry and I went knocking on the doors of all these cable operators And I can still see their face when I made this suggestion. They'd look at me like I'd lost my mind, that why would anybody want to watch that? And why would this industry want to support it? But in the end, it was that kind of a person that owned cable television systems that said, I like this idea. And as a matter of fact, the guy's name was Bob Rosencrantz, and he said, I'm going to give you a check for $25,000. You take that and tell everybody else that you run into in the cable business that I'm supporting it. That's what it took. I mean, my name meant nothing, but it was really interesting to watch that change because they were looking for new ideas and new programming.
Why did that happen? Cable industry driven by profit. What convinced them to support C-SPAN and to support educating the country about politics and government?
The early sponsors were interested in doing something other than just movies and sports. And frankly, I've learned this by living in this town for 53 years. It's always about the money. And C-SPAN is not that expensive. It wasn't that expensive when we started. It's not that expensive today. We have a budget today of a little over $60 million. And anybody that's ever been in television knows that's nothing. We only have 260 people that work there. That's a critical part of this, is keeping the cost down. And then people won't look at you and say, why are you spending all of our money on this? So in the early days, it took civic-minded people plus a fairly low amount of money to try to start something like this, because it never made a dime for anybody.
One of the reasons I think you're so important in this country is you've protected the integrity of C-SPAN since its inception. A lot of people, when they hear C-SPAN or watch it for the first time, they're not really sure about its mission or what drives it. It's not been politicized at all. You've been able to keep it down the center, informative. How tough has that been, and how important has that been to your career?
It has not been tough, and I'll tell you why it's not been tough. And a bunch of my colleagues are in the audience tonight. Our Vice President of Engineering, Roxanne Kerr, our Chief Engineer, Richard Fleeson. You met Rob Kennedy. None of those people want to insert politics into what we do. We know what our mission is. Our industry has allowed us to stay on mission. That's a critical part of this. They've never asked us once how many people watch, because we don't have ratings. And the people we've got 85 people, I think, at C-SPAN that are over 55 years of age. Most of them started when they were 22.
And they've stayed.
And they've stayed. And they believe in the mission. We have absolutely no interest whatsoever in being on a side. It's easy. If that's your mission and you stick by it, you stop worrying about it.
Why did you decide for that to be the mission? That has defined C-SPAN. Why early on did you decide that needed to be the mission?
This will sound a little hokey. I came out of Lafayette, Indiana. I was in the Navy. I was trained by my high school radio teacher and a mentor at the local television station, and my friend who hired me to work at the radio station in the early days. Those three people taught me what journalism was. And journalism was not to be on a side. And when I came here in the Navy and started working from the Pentagon in the Defense Department over there with people in the media, I learned that that was not the case, that a lot of the journalists that I work with had strong views, they were not afraid to tell you their views, and I saw it seeping into their reporting. So, the rose-colored glasses came off in those early years, and I said, if I can ever have a part in providing a service that gives all sides, not just two sides, and stay out of it, I'd love to be able to do that, and I've been a very lucky person to be able to see that come true. And it took a lot of people. It wasn't me, it was a lot of people, and that's what made the difference. It's a cooperative, and it really is a cooperative the closer you get to it.
I know we have some younger members in the audience here, high school students. Take me back to that moment and how much of a thrill it may have been when the House of Representatives decides to let cameras in and C-SPAN is there. Congress had never been seen by many people in this country in action.
Well, I'll tell you, the first day it happened, something very strange took place. I, of course, very excited about the first day, invited my board of directors. And at the time, I think there were as many as 41. These were all cable operators. And they all assembled in the House of Representatives. And the switch was flipped and we went on the air. And then I asked the late Congressman Jack Brooks of Texas to come and make comments, because he had been chairman of the committee that had started it. And I was very anxious and nervous, and I had the board in the room. And this is not going to make sense to you when I tell you what he said. It still to this day doesn't make sense to me. He did have a great sense of humor, but it didn't work out too well that day. He came in and he stood up at the microphone and he said, "Today is a great day in American history. The House of Representatives went on television. No thanks to you goddamn bastards." Somehow or another, I never forgot that. And it was weird. I didn't know what to do at the time, and I thought, boy, are those guys going to think this was really a great idea. But that's the way it started. But the first day, the headlines in the newspapers, and I remember Paul Duke, who was a predecessor of yours at your Friday night show on PBS, wrote a story for the Wall Street Journal, and the headline was something like, "House goes on television, boring." So in the very early days, people said, why would anybody want to watch that? It is boring. It's like watching grass grow. We have lived with that from the beginning of our existence. And it's amazing. People that I like very much who work in the media today keeps writing that. They keep writing it all the time. And it's kind of seeped into the system. That is boring. That is like watching grass grow. The sad thing about it, though, is meanwhile, and it was just announced today, last year, we spent $1.2 trillion that we don't have, and nobody's paying attention. And in the last 10 years, every year, it's averaged out to $1 trillion that we don't have. So we provide an opportunity for you to watch how your money's being spent, but frankly, not many people are paying attention. And if you think these young folks that were up here early are threatening the existence of this country with climate change in 10 years, think about the money part of it that nobody's paying attention to.
When you think about the climate issue and also the fiscal issues in this country, C-SPAN does air committee hearings, but it also airs many events, symposiums. Are you concerned about the lack of broadcasting on those issues beyond C-SPAN? I know C-SPAN has a focus on them at times, but is that part of the reason maybe people aren't paying attention? Is that it's just not available to many people out there? Climate conferences, committee hearings. I mean, I know C-SPAN has a video library, but...
I think the people in this country want to be entertained. And I think the people in the news business have figured that out. I don't want to be overly critical of people that are in the business that I'm in, but it's become a show. And it's become a ratings grab, and they're making lots and lots and lots of money. And people that work in the business are making lots of money. And so it's, as I said earlier, it's always about the money. And if you want to know why the news networks have become what they are, look at the bottom line. Billions of money are being made every year. And it's always going to be the fact. And I think that people, again, we have so much entertainment that was provided by Tom Whitehead's original dream of open skies and 6 different companies up there competing, that it's a tremendous thing. I'm like everybody else in this room. I love good entertainment. So I think it's hard for people to realize that while they're not watching, funny things are going on with their money. And someday, I think we're going to wake up and really be shocked by what happens to the whole system.
What are your hopes for C-SPAN in the coming decades?
Survive.
Why do you question its survival?
This is a tough time. And I remember reading today that I think the Poynter Institute was reporting that USA Today won't have a print edition very soon. Your paper is so strong because primarily of your owner, and there aren't many papers in this country today that have that kind of an owner, and I spend most of my waking days reading instead of watching something. And although our budget is low and our mission is very well defined, on a long-term basis, the cable and satellite numbers are going this way. They went this way for the first 35 years, and now they're going this way because, again, these young folks that are sitting out here don't watch television. They watch their phones. And our financial base is totally dependent on people that either subscribe to cable or subscribe to the satellite. And that's going down, and we don't know at this stage how far that's going to go. I have to tell you that the young man that was out here introducing me is the secret of our future success with his cohort, Susan Swain, because I'm old. He still's got a lot of years left, and he's a tremendous financial operator. He knows exactly where every penny is, and that's what it's going to be determined to keep our costs in line with what our value is perceived to be, and keep the money coming in, and hopefully the industry will stay strong enough to be able to support us.
And I want to get some questions from the audience here. We have some microphones, but these are serious issues we're discussing. You've been at the forefront of the cable industry about educating this country, about its government, but you've had a lot of fun. I've so enjoyed, I know many of you have, Brian's interviews with authors, political figures, literary figures over the years. When you look back at your career and all the innovation you've done, you've had a lot of fun. Which stands out as some of the most fun in terms of those interviews on Q&A or book notes?
Oh, the most fun. I mean, I interviewed this guy a couple years ago.
That doesn't count. Leave that aside.
It did count because he was president of his senior class.
All right.
In his high school.
The interviewer can't resist going back to interviewer mode.
And the one thing he wanted to do more than anything else was invite John Mayer to.
That is true. John Mayer played my prom. I'm going to cut in, Brian. But let me say, a little known fact about Brian Lamb is that he interviewed many music personalities when he was a young man.
I did. I interviewed Nat King Cole in 1960. Never will forget it. He died just a couple years later. It was really, really sad. I will tell you one of my favorite stories about interviewing musicians and musical people. When I was 17, I interviewed little Brenda Lee when she was 15 in Indianapolis. And I had this technology, this beautiful piece of technology, a little portable tape machine that ran on triple A batteries. And I went to this Murat Hotel in Indianapolis, and I sat at, her mother was with her, just the three of us. I was doing a little disc jockeying, and then I put the tape recorder on the table, and I interviewed her right there, and I was absolutely thrilled. I got in my car to drive back from Indianapolis to Lafayette, and I turned the tape machine on, and it sounded like this because the battery wasn't strong enough. And in the next year, I got to interview the Kingston Trio, and guess what? I had my little mobile unit, my little tape recorder. This time I had electricity. I sat down to interview Dave Guard and Bob Shane and Nick Reynolds, the Kingston Trio. And when I said, if you guys don't mind, let me check my tape, it didn't take. And if I had to go back and tell my boss, Henry Rosenthal, that I didn't get the Kingston Trio for his radio station, I'd have been probably out of a job. So I said to them, and I swallowed hard, would you guys mind doing this again? And I'll never forget them when they said, absolutely, we understand. And so, yeah, those were the fun things. But to answer your question directly about C-SPAN, the greatest thing for me in my life ever, frankly, is interviewing people like you, interviewing people who have been authors of books, and learning. I was never a great student. I didn't love learning as much when I was in college as I did love working at the radio station. And for the last 41 years of being involved in C-SPAN, the learning thing is phenomenal. As my wife could tell you, Vicki, who's here, that we spend a lot of time together reading. And it's just fantastic. And
one person many people have enjoyed hearing you interview over the years was Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who once said of Brian Lamb, he has, quote, striven for an educated electorate. Brian Lamb.
Thank you, man.
So let's take some questions. We have time for a few questions. There's a few mics around the room. If you want to, the mics can raise their hand. Yes, this gentleman here. There's some mics over here as well. If you want to stand up and go to the mic. Yes.
Hi, Lynn Wells. What do you think was the biggest single broadcast impact of C-SPAN? What event, broadcasting, if anything, made the biggest difference from your perspective?
Well, you partisans in the crowd weren't going to like this, but the biggest impact we probably have had in the last 40 years was when a young man stepped up to the microphone in 1979 by the name of Newt Gingrich. And he began a process of, you remember him, he's still around today, he's still very much on television. He was rather confrontational, and that led to what is a very confrontational town today. I'm not sure, you can't necessarily blame that on Newt Gingrich, but the fact that he could come to the floor of the House of Representatives and give a 1-hour speech every day, and he was a history professor, and be able to say whatever he wanted to say, led to him forming a group called the Conservative Opportunity Society. And probably in the long history of us, that would be the most important thing that we've seen happen on our network.
When was the moment you were most surprised by the impact of C-SPAN on the national discourse?
I'm not so sure this is going to be on the national discourse. I can tell you that when Ronald Reagan was president, and when he was governor, he did these shows on cable television with kids. And early in his presidency, when we started, he asked one of his aides, he said, I want to do those cable television shows again with kids. And as Washington, you would understand this, Bob, and the rest of you in this town that work here, he started asking his aide, do you set that up for me to be able to talk to kids on cable? And time went by and nothing was happening. And it turned out that the people that were right around him, immediately around him, didn't want him to do those programs with kids in cable. And finally, the guy that worked with him, Joe Holmes, went to one of our cable operators and said, would you guys be interested in this? And we said, sure. He came to us and he said, that would be tremendous. And eventually, a year went by and nothing happened. And Ronald Reagan was with Joe Holmes, who was one of his, the guys that hung around him when he would travel. And he said, Joe, he used some stronger language than I am. He said, where are those programs with kids with cable? And finally, after a year, we got our access to bringing 45 young people into a room. There was no planning ahead of time. It was not set up for a half hour. He would say, what's your question? And the kids were great and it was very interesting. It was done in the old executive office building. And we then took those young people back to our studio, and this was a last-minute decision, and played the program in the afternoon and then opened our phones up. And I was hosting at the time, and the calls would come up on a little screen and say, next call, Denver, Colorado, whatever. And a call came up on the screen and said, Washington, D.C. And in those days, you paid a lot of money for long-distance phone calls, so I just let the Washington, D.C. calls sit there because they weren't paying anything. And Rob's colleague, Susan Swain, the co-chief executive officer of C-SPAN, was in the back. And in those days, everybody did everything as they still do. And she knew what was going on, so she got on the screen and said, take the call now. And I looked up and I had no idea what this was. And so next call, Washington, D.C. And this very mature woman's voice came on, Mr. Lamb? And I said, yes. She said, one moment for the president. And bingo, there he is, Ronald Reagan on our call-in show saying, I just came back to the living quarters here and I turned on the set and there you were, and I heard one of the young people say something and I wanted to correct what they said. The interesting thing about this is, and the thing it has a long-lasting point to be made, is that he went back to the living quarters and nobody was controlling what he saw on television. And he literally picked up the phone and called the operator and says, get me on that show. And the White House operators, those of you who've worked there know, they get anybody anywhere in the world on the phone quickly. So he got through on the call-in show. So that was an experience that I did not expect to happen. And anybody who's ever seen the tape will see my face. It's like it fell, like, oh my God, it's the President of the United States.
We'll take a couple more.
Brian, I'm not a fast reader, but I enjoy reading. And I'm curious, I remember seeing my parents watching book notes when that started and thinking, how does he have time to read all these books? I'm curious from your perspective, what your strategy was for that. How did you go through that? How did you balance that with everything else you were working on, and then ask inquisitive questions of your guests and getting the answers from them?
Well, one of the things that people would often say in this town when they would go on any of the shows, and this is not knocking the shows because the interviews aren't that long, they would say, you know, he didn't read my book. And you heard it so often that I decided that if I could have the opportunity, I wanted to prove that you could read a book and then interview somebody and let them tell their story. And so we started Book Notes back in 1989. It was one guest, nonfiction, only one time on the show, hardback, and that's how it started. And I decided I was going to read the book. Now, my terrific wife is in this audience tonight, and we did not get married until I was 63, and it was my first and only wife, and will only be my only wife. Thank you, Victoria. And I was nuts about getting this done, and I would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd read until 6, and then I'd go to work. And I was bound and determined to read every book. Now, I can't promise you that out of the 801 books on Book Notes that I read over those years, that I read every word of it, but I read probably 75% of them, and the rest of them I spent enough time to know what was in them. It was the greatest learning experience of my life. And it was a goal. Actually, she's not going to be happy with me for telling you, but Tom Whitehead's wife is in this audience, and Margaret Whitehead, Dr. Margaret Whitehead, and she was an inveterate watcher of Book Notes and would call me and go over the show and tell me whether it was good or bad or whether she liked the person, which was a tremendous thing if anybody takes any interest in anything you do. And so I have just nothing but great memories of the people that would watch that show and come up and want to talk about it. And in particular, an author who would come on and say the next time I saw them, you know, you sold me 1,000 books or whatever it was. It's just that simple. And it's, you know, I stopped doing it about 6 months ago. And it's like you gave up a significant part of your life.
Brian, a lot of people here don't know that C-SPAN, almost like younger people, don't know that C-SPAN almost went under at one time, and that you got on the air and did a very special thing. And I hope you might tell them a little bit about that. But also, you had a problem getting the attention of the Hill at first, and people weren't coming over to be interviewed by you. And what tipped the balance in all of that?
Good questions.
Was it Gingrich being on the floor? Or what made them come over at last?
To be honest, and that is Margaret Whitehead. To be honest, Margaret, we get fewer members of Congress today than we did in the beginning. They don't like the call-in show. Their press secretaries, and I was one, tell them not to do the show. It's a very big disappointment. The leaders won't come do the show. And in the beginning, the leaders all came. Tip O'Neill, Jim Wright, Newt Gingrich, all of those people came. But today, they don't come at all. And part of that is because of all the proliferation of all the different places that people can go. The most valuable thing that we do, and some of you are going to frown at this, is open the phones up every day to hear 60 Americans call in 7 days a week. And if you want to hear America, and it's the only place in this country that you can hear America on all sides. You can hear an African American conservative call. You can hear a white liberal, a white conservative, somebody from Puerto Rico, somebody who is Hispanic, and they all call in that 3-hour period in the morning, and they listen to all sides. There is no place else in today's media where that happens, because the radio shows are all on one side. And it's fun to listen to. I listen to everything, all the time, both sides. And it's fun to listen to the call on those shows, because what they do, the host of the shows, if it's a conservative program, they'll let a liberal call through and then beat up on them. That's all part of a technique of keeping an audience. So we've been lucky to be able to hear all these different sides. I have to tell you a Margaret Whitehead story. Margaret's a great watcher of C-SPAN over the years. She's not going. I don't think you're going to like this story, but she used to live in Los Angeles, and there was a 3-hour time difference in Los Angeles. And she told me this story one time. She got up one morning and she'd taken a shower. I think it was a shower. It could have been a bath for all I know. But she went into her bedroom and she didn't have any clothes on. I wasn't. And she turned on the set and there I was. And the first thing she went was, "Oh my God."
That's the most PG-13 C-SPAN has ever been. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.